Welcome everyone. Today we have another new episode, and this is very important show, especially blockchain technology, which is very popular in Asia Pacific. I'm sure Singapore, China, Malaysia, and many other countries, they are introducing this blockchain technology. Besides that, we need to create more awareness how it works, what is the benefit, what type of challenges it has. So I want to start from Professor Edwards. That how do you want to define today's topic, blockchain technology for Industry 4.0?
Okay, well, first I'll just say a few framing words. In most of these broadcasts, two concepts emerge. First of all, the technology we're talking about are tools. And like any tool, you have to figure out where's the appropriate use for the tool. A hammer is good for certain things. It's not good for, cleaning a glass window. So that's the first thing. And the second thing, of course, is that using tools involves entrepreneurship. That is, judging where you're going to be most efficiently using whatever tool you have. So think of blockchain, first of all, as a tool. What kind of tool? Well, it's a digital tool for tracking information quality and things of that sort. Blockchain was originally developed, or the original big use was for cryptocurrencies. That is to say, if I send you a document that says I will give you $10 worth of value, you can basically reproduce that document and give it to a bunch of other people, and then everybody will come to me and say, give me the $10. How can I make sure that we don't have that kind of thing? Well, blockchain was a way of saying, here is essentially a tag that says I owe you $10 in value, and you can give it to somebody else, but you can't reproduce it. And so, in a sense, it tracks the currency. Well, you can take that technology, as it were, and apply it in manufacturing, and that's in fact what we've seen emerging in the last number of years. I think it was I want to say 2014 that this emerged, something like that. Rob probably knows better than I do, but what it does in manufacturing is it allows processes, logistics, parts, transportation, all of the processes that go into manufacturing to be very accurately tracked in what we call blocks, obviously digital blocks. So, for example, a part might originate in a particular place, and it can essentially, in a sense, be tagged, so we know where it was produced, we know who produced it. One of the big problems, for example, dealing with China is counterfeiting. And so you can have a property rights tag that this is certified to comply with property rights. Quality, this is certified to be of the quality standard that the manufacturer wants. And throughout the blockchain, as things are transported and ordered and so forth, the block is something that cannot be altered, or cannot be altered with any kind of ease. So that if something is basically certified as this is complies with certain property rights, well, now when it goes to you, you can look at it and say, yep, there it is, it's certified, and I know that somebody hasn't counterfeited it. And then if it goes to Rob does know you, and Rob knows me. But the point is that this is a way that people in different countries, people who don't know each other, in organizations and enterprises that don't know each other and haven't dealt with each other, can have some confidence that their transactions will be valid, that the quality will be good, that the timeliness, if something is not on time, well, now we know why it isn't on time. It's a big ledger in a sense, and it's an accessible ledger. Now, by the way, there's a whole issue that I'm sure we'll get into later about to what extent do you allow the blockchain to be viewable only by, for example, the enterprises that are using it versus a public, a more open source blockchain. But the point is, it's an incredible tool that even in just a few years it's been out there, is helping manufacturers around the world. And I think it's going to be one of the waves of the future.
Thank you. Professor Rob, you are a technology analyst, and you have a detailed understanding about blockchain technology. So if you give us a detailed examples and how it works and how it will be helpful for specifically finance industry or banking or these things, you can share with our audience.
Well, blockchain is a distributed ledger. It keeps track of transactions in a secure fashion. Edward pointed out correctly that the nature of blockchain is the redundant data that occurs in each of the blocks, making it very hard to come in from the side and hack the information, because it's going to then disagree with the other blocks, and you're going to catch the problem almost immediately. Blockchain has been hacked. There have been some pretty large breaches using blockchain. It's like any technology. It's not perfect and it's not unhackable. It's just more secure than other methods that you might otherwise use to secure a transaction. It came to be because Bitcoin was being used for a lot of transactions that people wanted to remain confidential. And the nature of blockchain is you don't really know the seller of the good. You don't really know the buyer of the good. You don't have to. You can, but you don't have to. What happens within the blocks is a set of validation steps that assures you are who you say you are, well, you're a valid individual, and that you've got something to sell. You actually have something to sell. And then the other person is validated as a valid individual, and they've got the money to buy. The transaction occurs, and if that transaction is illicit, and a lot of the transactions initially with regard to Bitcoin and blockchain were illicit, in other words, illegal transactions, people buying and selling goods that were illicit. It's very hard to break apart that transaction and figure out who did what. Now, that was the beginning of blockchain came to be around 2009, matured over the last decade to become a much more viable architecture. It's not that fast. And when I say not that fast, it's not fast enough, say, for the stock market to use. It is fast enough for general banking to use, because you can do transactions in fractions of a second, and it's fast enough. But stock transactions happen so much faster that we have not been able to figure out how to use blockchain in those very high-speed transactions, because it simply is not quick enough. But just think of it as a secure ledger, a way to do a transaction that validates many of the steps. Banking likes it a lot because it has addressed pretty aggressively the kind of fraud that banks tend to face in transactions. And as I say, it secures both ends and the transaction itself. Though it's not absolutely secure, nothing's absolutely secure. So it's just a better way of doing things.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you. Professor Edward, as you involved with the policy making and other things, how blockchain technology actually helped to develop our voting system, how it works? Even the developing nations, they have a lot of challenges, especially for the democracy, for their voting system. Do you think that if they integrated this blockchain technology, it will help them to create a real, transparent, democratic election policy? What do you think?
Well, I'm tempted to say we should try it here as well in the United States.
Yes.
Well, that's a whole different discussion, because we've had, as you know, there's serious controversies in the United States about voter fraud and plus not only on the one side voter fraud and not doing the transactions properly. And this goes back, by the way, decades and decades. This isn't just in the last election. And of course, you have on the other side the problem of accessibility. How easy is it to vote, and especially in the time of the pandemic. In my area during the election, you could vote by mail, you could physically go in and mark your ballot, and you could do a ballot and put it in, and you could put it in a drop box, and there were like 5 different ways of doing it, and then each state legislature had a different way of regulating, and it was kind of a mess, frankly, but that's the way a federalist system works. But one of the problems in fact, less developed countries, as you know, or emerging economies, I should say more accurately, is having an honest system. And it's one of the things that's correlated with, economic development, is having some kind of an honest political system. And so I certainly see where this could be applied so that citizens, not only, for example, in urban areas who maybe have easier access to voting, but in, for example, more rural areas could do this more easily. But again, this also depends on the technological infrastructure. For example, if you don't have internet access and some of these other things, then you have some serious problems. I think so. I think it's promising, and it would be something that would be interesting to see whether in countries that don't have as open and free a system, whether the powers that be would like this idea or not. I would hope that they would, but that's going to be another problem. But as Rob has suggested, I think the big value of blockchain is in what it's going to be able to do for manufacturing, for logistics, and that sort of thing. But even here, there is a political and a public policy issue. Blockchain, as Rob has suggested, initially was used because people wanted to have transactions that were not necessarily legal. If you're buying drugs, for example, that are illegal drugs and things of that sort, and so it was anonymous, and so that in a sense, it allowed for certain things that were maybe not as nice as we would want. But the other thing is that it also means that government can't get in and regulate. And so this is an interesting question about to what extent is this anonymous so that it means that governments can't get in and regulate. One of the most serious problems I see internationally with globalization, I like globalization in terms of integrating economies. I like globalization in terms of free trade. I've written about free trade with Asia, especially since the 1980s. But there's also a problem with globalization that regulators in different countries want to control competition. One of the big debates we're having right now in the United States, for example, is whether we should have an international taxing system. And the concern is that, well, if a country cuts its taxes, all the capital goes to that country, and that country is benefiting, whereas the country that has high taxes doesn't benefit. Of course, I think that's a good thing. I think if you're going to punish people for being productive, well, too bad. Their capital is going to go elsewhere. But our Secretary of the Treasury now is talking about, well, maybe we should have an international tax system so we can make sure that nobody cuts their taxes too low. And I think that would be terrible. But getting back to the topic of blockchain, you can see where international regulators might say, gee, we have to get a handle on this because there are a lot of transactions that are going on that we can't regulate. And I think that's a good thing that they can't regulate them in general, except for safety. By the way, here's another thing that is maybe a good thing about blockchain. Okay. I've written about the problems of renewable technologies and the fact that, for example, in Congo, all the international organizations have noted how many tens of thousands of children are being abused in mining cobalt, for example. Okay. And that's something I don't think anybody can disagree with, that this is a horrible thing. And in China, it's basically rare earth elements. In South America, it's lithium. And there's a lot of not only environmental problems, but human rights abuses there. And so is there a way of blockchain can potentially certify that, this particular mineral was mined without children? So you would think that would be a good thing if you could do something along those lines to make sure that the mining in that particular case is not something that's abusing children or violating some other regulation that we would agree about.
Thank you. Professor Rob, how do you want to analyze the scope of blockchain, that different area we can utilize blockchain, including these voting systems and banking systems and some other places we can utilize it?
Well, the scope is, as I say, it's a distributed ledger system. So that anything that would require a ledger to keep track of what occurred, blockchain is a viable solution for. It's often used for logistics, purchases at scale, banking transactions, credit card transactions. The interesting thing with regard to voting is where it has been partially implemented is in Russia, of all places, in their voting system, and it was used when they were considering changes to the Russian constitution. Which is kind of one place where you figure they probably don't really care whether the voting is secure or not, because the impression is the government figures out how you're going to vote, and that's how it's going to come out. So it's the fact that they're using blockchain would suggest that those impressions may not be entirely accurate. But what it is it protects anonymity while securing the transaction and making sure that fraud is minimized. And a lot of the emerging countries have a lot of fraud problems. So if you're going to try to put back in place efficiency in your economic transactions, then blockchain is a good technology to use to do that. And fraud is basically monetary waste. It's money that's going places you don't want it to go. And if you've got programs to help the poor, to improve infrastructure, the more bleeding those programs have with fraud or graft or other forms of corruption, the less good they're going to be able to do. So that this just increases the overall efficiency of the flow of money from one place to the other without necessarily requiring both parties be disclosed. So it can be used for things like voting, where anonymity is a critical component. And as mentioned before, it's also, of course, used for illicit transactions where anonymity is also important. And those transactions may not just be illicit drugs. They could be just transactions occurring between parties that are doing something that the government doesn't necessarily want done, but might be good long term for the people in that particular country. It's kind of hard to tell. But if you just think of it as a distributed secure ledger, then any place where something like that would benefit, that's where you can use blockchain.
Thank you. Yes, Professor Edward. Yeah.
I just want to mention one other. This is just another component of blockchain, is that normally when businesses deal with one another, whether it's a contract for purchasing or any kind of transaction, you're talking about a contract. A purchase is a contract, okay? And usually any kind of industrial purchase is usually not, me giving you $1 and then you giving me a part. It's, we make a contract, you promise to deliver certain things at certain quality, and we have lawyers sitting down going through these things and making sure everything is okay. And you have lawyers basically trying to figure out whether they've abided by the contracts and all of this sort of thing. One of the things blockchain can do is to minimize that sort of legal activity, which is necessary to protect property rights, to make sure that the business gets the quality they want on time, etc. But blockchain can basically minimize that sort of legal contract work, again, which adds to the efficiency of doing business. I don't have to sit down with you and an army of lawyers to do some transaction. I can say, yep, looks like this thing is okay because I looked at the block, and you can't change the block, without, very easily. So, hey, we've got some extra efficiency. And again, it's one of these things that most people, and hopefully your audience is learning more about this, and so you have a very sophisticated audience, don't understand all of these little things that happen or that are advantageous with something like blockchain, much less other technologies.
Yes, Professor Rob. Beside that, like when we're discussing about any technologies and other things, we have to think about government policy, how we can develop more human resources who can help to grow these technologies, and corporation who can invest more on this technology. So what is your advice for these three aspects? Number one, how government can play roles, how we can develop more human resources like blockchain, who can develop blockchain technology or become a good engineers, and number three, how corporates should more invest on these things.
Well, clearly, if you're going to become an expert in blockchain, you need to have a solid STEM background. This is a cryptologically based technology, and it does mean that you need engineers that can understand it. The first thing that a government can do is certainly develop expertise inside. The blockchain could effectively be used to handle the government transactions, and often governments are kind of a cesspool of fraud, and because they move so much money around, there's plenty of opportunity to take that money and apply it to things that the government didn't intend to have it applied. And this is the kind of thing that blockchain can address. Now, be aware that blockchain, as I said before, isn't perfect. It's just better than whatever else they're likely using in terms of security. It's not 100% unhackable. It's just harder to hack it. But the thing is, you do require pretty strong skills and access to be able to break into this distributed ledger and alter it in a way that where you won't get caught. And that means it just raises the bar, particularly in a developing nation, with regard to the level of competency the attackers have to have in order to compromise it. And once the government begins adopting it, they in effect create a market for the people that are building the technology. And if they're then they have a place to put the people that are developing the skills to use it and better secure it. And so it becomes kind of a circular process. Government takes interest. That fuels companies to supply it. It provides an opportunity for schools to train students into the technology. And then those students have a place to go when they graduate that's tied to the technology. It creates kind of a somewhat, well, not really a circular economy, but it creates a demand level that's required to develop the skill set the country needs to deploy, secure, and understand the technology so it's used appropriately. So that's kind of how you do it.
Mm-hmm. Professor Edward, yes.
Yeah. I want to endorse what Rob said, especially about maybe government using blockchain. One of the things I've been involved with for, frankly, several decades, sometimes directly, sometimes indirectly, is looking at how the United States government spends money and where the waste is. And for example, there have been some studies in the past about how many literally billions of dollars the Pentagon just loses. It's like, and we're not just talking about a few dollars here. You're talking about tens of billions of dollars, and they don't know where it went. They can't even figure it out. I've done work more directly on the U.S. Postal Service, for example, in this country, which employs about 500,000 people, and so forth. And it's just, in many of these areas, it's just a mess. In fact, a friend of mine, his brother was tasked with auditing the Pentagon a couple of years ago because it's such a mess. And so, and by the way, this is not just the Pentagon. I can talk about other government agencies in the United States. And so, being able to securely track what's happening and say, okay, first of all, we know where the money went, and we can see where the waste, fraud, and abuse is. That would be very good in the United States, and it would certainly be good in other in emerging economies. On the human resources issue that you bring up, Rob is right about having that kind of technological knowledge. I would add, though, that and this has come up in so many of our discussions about having not just the focus, but a little bit of a broader understanding, because you're going to be dealing with the technology, the encryption, and so forth, but you're also going to be dealing with the applications of it. So having both that focus and sort of a broad understanding of manufacturing and logistics and so forth, having that sort of broad knowledge base. If I were putting together a course in a university for that, I would have that focus. Plus, I would have sort of, well, you have to understand a little bit of how manufacturing works. You have to understand a little bit about how trade works. You have to have this kind of broad understanding of the ecosystem, let's say, of companies and distributed companies, global companies, and so forth. And that's going to really help you to be a value and a resource to the company, as well as if you're working for the government on this. And then to your third part of your inquiry, in terms of what companies can do and corporations can do. Well, again, a lot of them right now are looking at this. I forget, there's something like 80%, I think, in the United States have said they've had some kind of blockchain dealings. Not that they're using it themselves, but they've somehow encountered it. I think about 15 or 20%, I forget, maybe Rob knows the number better than I do, have actually been looking at using it and integrating it into, as a program or a part of their own process. And so I would say companies should look at this and, again, think of it as a tool, look at where it can be most beneficially used, but don't think of it as, well, it's a hammer, so let's bang everything with it. There are other tools you can use as well.
Thank you. Professor Rob, you have some different analysis on that particular point? Yeah.
No, blockchain's been growing really rapidly. It's pretty much universal in banking, at least in the developed world now. Not for everything, but it's certainly being used for most transactions, I think, at this point. It grew 300% in 2020. And escaped from banking pretty readily. It's as I say, it's like anything else. When you've got a world that has prevalent fraud, something that addresses that fraud relatively inexpensively, given the cost of the fraud, is going to be very popular, and blockchain does do that job. That using it for voting has been kind of an interesting discussion for some time, because what you've got a secure transaction. What's the problem then with using blockchain? And most of the people that come out against using blockchain for voting talk about things like, well, how do you know the voter isn't being coerced now that they're no longer in the voting booth and they're voting remotely or something along those lines? But those same problems exist for mail-in voting as well. Another issue, though, is if you're going to implement it, you do need to implement a way for the voter to confirm that their vote. I mean, that's part of what blockchain is good for. Is you can, after you complete the transaction, you can go back in and confirm the transaction. This is something I think most voting systems do not provide. Is how do you know your vote was counted? You voted, but do you have any validation step that says that says your vote, the vote that you put in, was counted the way that you intended it? Now, blockchain doesn't have to be implemented that way, but it can, and that's where the benefit comes forward. Is the individual voter then can go back in and say, I'm kind of curious. People are saying the election was a fraud, and votes were counted. How was my vote counted? And you can go back and look. And of course, if there's a discrepancy and the vote that was counted was different than yours, it provides that audit step that every individual then has to go back in and validate that their vote was counted the way they intended. I think that really should be part of every voting system, with the issue continually being in most voting systems, because to do that, they need to know who you are, and voters are supposed to be anonymous. That anonymity then becomes a block to audit. I honestly think it's a huge mistake. People put stickers on their cars. They tell people how they voted. I'm not sure that anonymity holds up any length of time at all. But I take it as mostly it's whoever's in power just wants to make sure that they don't get voted out and somebody gets voted in, and allowing more people to vote is a problem. Another complaint is blockchain is an inherently digital technology. So if you are using smartphones or whatever, maybe the poor people don't have smartphones, but at least in the developed world, to get access to the benefits that they need to have, they have to at least sometime get access to a computer or a smartphone or something. And you can always provide blockchain secured voting. Even if you don't do it remotely and use smartphones. Dominion Voting has been implementing a blockchain technology at the back end for a while to secure the transmission of the data from the voting machines to the central repository. So it can be used using traditional hardware as well. If you don't like the idea of people using smartphones or PCs, then you can implement it as the back end of voting machines and at least secure the transmission of data. It certainly would appear to be a lot more secure than printing out the paper records that are then taken and manually transacted, or using the old tape methods, and those tapes can be compromised in transit. Voting in most places right now is not very secure at all. It's just what makes it difficult is compromising it at scale, because it's very labor intensive, and if you're going to compromise it at scale, it's equally labor intensive. But it doesn't necessarily assure the votes that are being made are the votes that are being counted. And certainly, as we've seen across the world, there have been an awful lot of elections that have concluded questionably based on the exit polling that occurred in those different geographies, including here. So it's a critical technology to making sure that transactions, whether they be votes or monetary transactions, happen the way that you intend them to happen. And there are protections over it that can counter many of the ways it's been hacked in the meantime. But it still has the regular exposures of almost any other system. If you can get access to the repository that's outside of the blockchain and make changes, it's vulnerable. And of course, if you can somehow compromise the input points at the front end, So that for instance, if the blockchain might certify your phone as being a valid phone and your level of authentication with the phone, if somebody is able to clone your phone and make it look like your phone is doing something else, that could be an inconsistency that could cause the problem. But you can always loop back to the individual and close the loop and just tell the individual, these are the votes that we recorded you voting. Is that correct? Yeah. And that can be done anonymously. So the people don't know that it's done. It's all contained within the system. So it's generally a better way to do things. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. By the way, I'll just add to that. And I know this not only because, for example, a friend of mine who used to work at the Wall Street Journal some years ago did a major book on voting fraud and the problems that, so this goes, well before the current election in the United States. But I've had friends personally during the last election who said, oh, you know what? I received a ballot, here where I live in Denver now, and where I used to live in Seattle, there's also a ballot up there for me in Seattle. And I can go over personal examples as well as, the fact that
Yes.
But basically, the voter rolls often are not purged when people move, when people die, and so forth, and that's a big problem in the United States.
Thank you. We have our new panelist, Mr. Paul from Good News Planet TV. So, sir, how are you? We are discussing on blockchain technology. So, what's your views regarding blockchain technologies, and what do you think about that?
I know hardly anything about blockchain. So,
okay.
I really just got on to say hello from New York, and I think we got enough problems with what we have already. But if blockchain can be helpful, the gentleman who just spoke, I mean, boy, he really thought this voting thing out. And I always thought that voting, is kind of a antiquated system, and technologically, we should be able to do better. So maybe blockchain is the approach, and seemed like it had a lot of answers to a lot of questions. So I thought that was pretty darn good. I just wanted to say, because actually we are broadcasting, or we're part of a cultural diversity show. It's World Day for Cultural Diversity for Dialogue and Development. And we're part of that broadcast at 11 a.m. worldwide. And I just wanted to say that New York is, it's, the good news is where we've paid a lot of pain and strain, and stayed at home, and we're responsible. I will say here, and in the metro area, I'll say overall, and by far in New York City. New York City last night, you would think nothing happened, it's good news, because New York, not because I live here and because it's a wonderful place to live. It's a good news because when a city like New York, a financial center and cultural center, bouncing back from this pandemic concern, it's a statement that as long as we don't have more problems, but if we get through what we have right now and we do all the things properly, then blockchain and finances and are the good parts of our economy, and maybe we'll be a little kinder and smarter with each other, the peace outreach. So I'm just saying that New York does feel like New York almost again. So I think that's a good thing for the world, being a multicultural place. That's it.
Yes.
Hey, Paul, while you're here, two quick things, or one quick thing. First of all, diversity, as far as I'm concerned, means also diversity of opinion and diversity of thought. And so one of the things I want to congratulate Sharif for is having exactly that in his broadcasts: diversity of opinion, diversity of thought, actually discussing things rationally. And so when you say diversity because I have certain skin color or whatever, those are accidents of birth. What distinguishes us as human beings is our minds. And so having this kind of discussion, having you pitch in like this, to me, that's what is wonderful. And I hope we see more of that in this country, just as Sharif is trying to have more of that in the Asian Pacific area. So here.
I agree with you. I'm going to have to run one. I agree. That's why I got on, because I like the wisdom on this call. From the few times I have gotten on, and the diversity. So thank you. I'd like to also show this photograph. This I don't know how well you can see it, but this is the famous blue marble from NASA from the moon. Okay, and talking about diversity, no boundary. I'm a John Lennonist. No boundaries, no borders, and I think that that's a nice thought about life. And we put a little virtue on the back of the card. You go to goodnewsplanet.tv, you can see this. But I'm going to just leave with this, if you don't mind, and thank you for indulging me.
Yes.
Thankfulness. I put a little virtue from my Hug a Planet buddy. He makes these Hug a Planets, little things you hug and so on. And this virtue says thankfulness, a warm, friendly feelings of gratitude and gratefulness. So I'm grateful and thank you, Sharif, for letting me.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Bye-bye. Yes, Professor Rob, let's back on this blockchain technology, because this is something that we are trying to add more guests. I think they will also join. So, yes, what your perception when we think about the what will be the future of this technology? Like they want to know Nur Fazrin from Malaysia that how it create better technology future, like this technology help them to better future for us.
Yeah, after that commercial break, which was just really weird. Once again, you're implementing a distributed ledger that's very secure. So it's one area that you perhaps don't have to worry as much about if it's in place, because it's more secure. You can focus on other areas that are problems. I don't know how many different ways we can talk about a distributed ledger in terms of, it's a ledger. It's just a secure ledger. It could be used to better build ships and structures, because the materials you're using, you're not paying excessively for them because the money's not being sidetracked or spun off to things that you didn't intend. But it's, I don't know what else we can say about this. It's a way to do business securely and better than probably how you're doing it today. So that any benefit there is significant, and it does allow you to connect systems that themselves are secure without necessarily compromising the security of those systems. So it's beneficial in that it better assures the money you're spending goes to where it is you intend it to be spent, and that whatever other transactions you're making, be it for physical goods or voting or whatever, it better assures those transactions than undoubtedly what you're using today. Many of these systems are very antiquated, and as a result, they're very unsecure, and this tends to address that.
Thank you. We have our new friend, Mr. Stewart, and he has a company he's managing blockchain technologies and very big corporation. He's working right now and help them to grow the business. So what do you want to share your experience about these blockchain technologies? And I'm sure you have good experience about Asia Pacific. You visited Malaysia and other countries. So how we can work on that particular technology?
Well, good afternoon. If you can hear me, I just want to make sure my microphone is working. That is good news. As you can see, I'm in my mobile studio today. I couldn't even get a backdrop to work, so I'm on a very thin bandwidth. So please excuse me if it's not as easy as it has been before. Listen, Sharif, I mean, great to speak and great to be alongside these two gentlemen who I've watched in previous videos and have learnt much from. So thank you very much. And my role comes very much on specifics around a particular focus I have around the role of blockchain technology in the role in finance and financial institutions. One of the key things for us about this has been that we see finances as being the kind of the first domino to fall. It's one of the key attributes of being able to achieve much of what we want to see going on around the world. People often talk about the transparency and the opportunity for trust. And I think what people have to understand is blockchain doesn't naturally create trust. It creates this opportunity for trust. And one of the factors we're looking at here in our role at the European Partnership Environment is how we can see that be basically integral and the instigator to many different factors around the world. So we have a lot of things going at the moment. As I said, we're looking to set up situation rooms. We're trying to support different organizations. We're working with some fantastic companies around the world in terms of also around Africa and the involvement around building the skill base there as well. So it's good to be on, and obviously very happy to talk further about some other areas as discussions develop.
Thank you. Yes, Professor Edward.
Well, I'm actually eager to hear your comments, because you're actually in the industry. You're not a policy geek like me who sort of sits back and pontificates. So I hope I do more than just that. But I would ask you. I would ask you specifically what sort of advantages you've seen with blockchain technology, and most important, where you see it going in the future. I've been reading a lot about not only the specific applications, but a friend of mine just did a book. He's actually on my board, so he's more than just a friend, called After Collapse. I'm going to be on a panel with him this summer, and he basically lays out a fairly pessimistic view of what's happening in the United States and the West in terms of our institutions not being able to keep up with advanced technology and so forth. But what he does is, the first half of the book is, oh, this is terribly depressing. And the second part of the book is, but we have a path forward. And one of the things he talks about in the path forward is, in fact, blockchain, not only for crypto, but for manufacturing, that this can mitigate any problems that we have in the future. So I'm kind of interested in somebody who's on the ground to tell us what your thoughts are, and perhaps any experiences that can enlighten us.
Yes, Mr. Stewart and Professor Rob, there is same question. I think this is the things we are trying to find out. What are the new scopes for industry created by the blockchain technology? Mr. Rob.
Yeah, sorry, you're going to have to explain what you mean by new scopes of industry created by blockchain technology. So once again, blockchain is a distributed ledger. So the industry that's best impacted by it is an industry that kind of requires a distributed ledger, which is banking. Anything to do with financial transactions, that's why it's pretty much in every friggin' bank in the planet right now. That's its benefit is, and as I said, it's directly addressing a problem the banks have, which has to do with banking fraud. So it's incredibly valuable. The downside to it is the transaction time. It's slow for stock transactions, so financial industry hasn't been quite as excited about it yet. But banking just loves this thing, and so the opportunity really is for businesses that work with banks to better understand and implement the technology to better secure their transactions. Unsecured transactions are a huge cost. Banks lose millions, if not billions, of dollars a year to faulty and fraudulent transactions, and this cuts into this. And generally, a blockchain pays
from
for
our perspective. I mean, the way we see
relatively short order. Sorry, go ahead, Stewart.
Mr. Stewart. Can you hear me, Mr. Stewart?
I thought you were talking over me, so I stopped.
I think he cannot hear clearly. Mr. Rob.
Stewart?
Mr. Stewart, can you hear me?
Are you still with us? That would be a no. Okay, so that's pretty much it. It's as Stewart pointed out, and he works with the banking industry. That's where the most lucrative blockchain business is at the moment. But it's certainly expanding out to enterprises, large companies that do transactions, and it's penetrating the logistics side of those companies pretty heavily, for much the same reason.
Yeah, but one thing, like many developing nations, example, still they do not develop better policy for blockchain technology. On the other hand, developed nations, they are integrated this blockchain technology. Let's say even Asia Pacific, Singapore adapting these blockchain technologies.
Oh, Singapore's always been very aggressive with regard to technology implementation. It's a great example of a government that is using technology for the kind of in an extreme fashion to create a more efficient and arguably safer environment. It's a bit autocratic as a result, but the people that live there seem to love it. It's really an excellent example of how government can work for the people using technology.
Right. By the way, I'll just add real quickly to what Rob has said, because I'm coming from particular political perspective, that Singapore is rated as the #1 freest economy in the world, and part of it is due to its government choosing where to intervene and where not to intervene. And you see that the mix that Singapore has created, #1, by the objective standard of the Index of Economic Freedom, ranks as the freest, and #2, it is of course one of the most prosperous places on the planet. It went from being a war-ravaged city after World War II to its standard of living is as high, if not higher, than in much of the developed world. In fact, it is the developed world.
Yes, but my question is that when the many developing nations still they do not implement it, or they do not have, example, Bangladesh do not implementing this blockchain technology, still they have barrier for this kind of things. On the other hand, example, Singapore or developed nations, they are implementing this technology, so it create huge difference. Even technology actually move very fast, so in between few years, what do you think, like how they can, this kind of developing nations can create better? Yes.
If they don't, I mean, here's the reality. This is becoming a de facto requirement for large-scale banking transactions, and governments are constantly trying to do these transactions with other governments with regard to aid, doing these transactions for offshore purchases, and their industry is clearly using these transactions as well. And so, if they're not implementing it, and the banking institutions we're working with have that now as a requirement, they're not going to be participating in a lot of these things. They may find themselves locked out of financial markets. So it's not a good situation to have, all the peer entities around you implementing a technology like blockchain, and you're not being able to implement it. Eventually it's going to lock you out. Blockchain is no longer an experimental technology. It's in full deployment in worldwide financial transactions. And if you're not on board with it, you're probably not going to be able to access many of the resources as time goes on that you need to access in order to remain viable as a government or an entity in the world's economic structure. So it's problematic if what you're saying is true, and a number of the governments have completely ignored the technology because at some particular point they're going to be locked out of the related transactions, and that's going to be really problematic in terms of. I mean, you think if sanctions are bad, being fundamentally locked out of worldwide banking is going to be a lot worse.
Thank you. We have our another speaker, Mr. Wolfgang, joined with us, and Mr. Stewart. Mr. Stewart, can you hear me? Mr. Stewart, can you hear me?
I can. Yes, I've changed implement. I'm hoping the hardware will work better this time. Can you hear me? More importantly, yes.
Yes.
That's good. Thank you. Thank you, Rob. I think listening to what Rob was saying was really fascinating here, because he's absolutely right. We're not quite at that stage yet, but the development of the way blockchain is being integrated into systems is actually going to shift the way kind of the economics and the whole processes of these things work. And therefore you will have those that aren't prepared to make the change. One of the roles actually in terms of our think tank is working with in between the commercialization of this and the governments and institutions. And what we're finding is we're finding a lot of people aren't integrating in the middle there. We're getting a lot of good quality development. We're getting a lot of skill base developing around on the ground, and we're getting a lot of interest. Not always functional, but we're seeing more and more it becoming integrated. We've done some work recently around raw materials and circular economies, and you can see how the necessity for blockchain actually is becoming something that people see as just second nature. But what is interesting, and I totally agree with you, Rob, I think we're not seeing necessarily the government's support and pick this up yet. And I think that's going to be absolutely critical going forwards, because that will provide a lot of what I call the institutional focus once we see it becoming a natural integral part. I'd be interested in people's views around this in terms of when we don't ever have these conversations in this kind of environment about blockchain, because everything's on it. I mean, how far are we from that? And, and what are the steps to get there? Because I think this is what the larger, more well-established institutions are trying to understand more. And I think that's what we're trying to kind of build scope around as well.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Mr. Wolfgang. Thank you for joining today's, and you are expert on supply chain management and definitely blockchain technology
Pause at
also.
that moment, Sharif.
Yes, Mr. Wolfgang, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yes, just we want to know more about blockchain technologies and how it will be helpful for supply chain management. And thank you, Mr. Homestoner, joining with us.
Yeah, I have only 9 minutes because I'm just getting this between two calls. I don't know where you stand in the discussion. So blockchain is a nascent technology. Blockchain has a future from my perspective, and can help, when I look at supply chain networks, can help to better manage the fragmented, very multi-stakeholder based global networks. So in that sense, my first message is the adoption is 5 to 10 years out. When we think about crypto has seen an uptake. So clearly, governments and especially not the governments, the banks have identified cryptocurrency as a new asset class and driving this. So we will see on this side significant development. But when it comes to mass adoption of supply chains in other areas, and this is and supply chain has been identified by many as one of the most promising areas. We are not yet there, and this for multiple reasons. When we think about the supply chain is the economy. Every movement of goods is supply chain. The transformation of materials, supply chain. So we talk about implementing blockchain in the whole economy or distributed ledger technology. That would mean that we need to ensure interoperability between multiple blockchain platforms. Interoperability is and between blockchain platforms and other platforms. So, and this is a major challenge. So we also have to keep in mind that the real advantage of blockchain is the distributing factor, means it's not governed by one entity. That's the revolutionary idea of blockchain. And there's currently no technology, no way to ensure interoperability between blockchain platforms without central powers, trusted partners. Because the only mechanisms that work is API gateways, and API gateways need to be trusted, so they need to be operated by trusted partners. And then we are again in a more centralized world with a technology that would like to be decentral, peer-to-peer based, without any independent trusted parties like banks, like lawyers, etc. So these are the complexity when we think about the application or the adoption of blockchain in supply chain networks. When it comes to the current stage, there are use cases, there are experiments. The biggest experiment that has been launched in the area of supply chain is TradeLens. TradeLens has been initiated by IBM and Maersk. Maersk is the biggest container shipping line in the world. And the purpose of TradeLens is in fact visibility and the handling of documents, the elimination at the end of documents. So electronic bill of lading, etc. And the challenge there is that in the team, the greatest frustration of blockchain is the speed blockchain can offer at that point. So also technically, we need to wait until we can apply blockchain technology at large scale. I'm working with one startup that uses blockchain and has established a use case together with one of the blockchain providers. But this is a use case that has been developed 2-3 months ago. There is, I don't want to mention that startup because I'm engaged there, but taking another startup, which is Everything. Everything is also a startup based on blockchain, ensuring digital identity. So this is another element which is important when we talk about blockchain. So I stop here saying we are in the experimenting phase. To have a mass adoption of blockchain in supply chain is not yet at the horizon. When we talk to governments, to answer that question, when it comes to governments, there was an initiative between the Hong Kong and Singapore government in financial services to establish collaborations and joint platforms. I don't know where that stands. Switzerland was definitely a country that pushed the whole crypto side and then the blockchain behind. Then another country where the government is supportive is Sweden. Also very often in the press is Estonia as one of the countries that is very much into any kind of digital technology. I think there are definitely governments that see this as an opportunity, but when you take the countries, places I mentioned, they are all small, meaning Hong Kong, Singapore, Switzerland, Sweden, small population, Estonia. So there is the interest probably driven by their goal to punch significantly above their weight and use technologies, and they come always in a technology stack to do this, to tap into flows which are beyond their national borders, because that space in the digital sphere is unlimited for every country. And then adding to what has been said before, of course, the countries that don't go on the train will have some challenges down the road. But I believe that there are few countries that are not working on the topic. It's just that some countries do it very openly, and that they need to invite a lot of participants, and this is why they need to be open to get the talent and get the traction, whereas the big countries probably work more behind the curtain because they are in front of competition with other very big players, and they don't want to put their cards on the table. But that is based on no evidence I've ever seen. But I cannot believe that governments are not looking into any kind of technology, and in particularly one which is, and that has also been said, probably very revolutionary for the financial sector. So I used, in fact, my 9 minutes. I used 8.
Ganz bestimmt.
But yeah, I wanted to share my views.
Thank you. We have our another speaker, Mr. Homestoner. Mr. Homestoner, thank you, Mr. Thank you. Bye bye. Yes.
I like
Mr.
the way you call me. I like the way you call me the elder spokesman.
Okay. Thank you.
We at the Chamber of Commerce see blockchain as a tool for our small and micro businesses. It's only going to grow and grow and grow because of the fact that you're putting tremendous amounts of proprietary information inside of an encrypted structure so that it can be shared with people inside the structure, and yet impervious to the people outside the structure. That is our interest in blockchain technology. Plus, it opens up a lot of efficiency factors, makes it much more efficient when you have all the players that are inside that blockchain that can share that information and make it go faster. We do presently, we're doing a lot of promotional activities, including seminars, workshops. We're doing a whole thing on streaming technologies in Monte Carlo in July. We're doing the Climate Change Forum in London in October. These will all be, blockchain will be a very big part of our discussions there, in the fact that it's not going to do anything but grow. The attention and the interest in this technology is unbridled. It's going to grow tremendously, especially in the near future, because of the fact that it empowers small and micro businesses to do things they could never do before. So I'm not an expert on it, but I can tell you, by being the chairman, I hear about it many times every single day. It is a tool, and it's going to be refined and improved daily because everyone is going to use it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you. Professor Edward, I think many interesting insight come from the industries as well as from corporations. So yeah, how do you want to add values?
Well, I mean, it's in a sense, it's very hard to add to that. I think they've all nailed it in terms of the future. By the way, I was struck by Wolfgang's comments about small countries, because I've worked. In fact, I was in Estonia. In fact, I helped in 1989, and I think in the early 1989, and then in the 1990s. I was involved in some of the transition there myself, and one of the things that they were trying to do is to say, we're a small country. We were, of course, up until then part of the Soviet Union, dominated by the Soviet Union, the communists, but they always had this independent streak. And they understood that they were a small country. They had to find a market niche. A gentleman named Mark Lars decided, we are going to go for a very free enterprise, high, sort of futurist looking approach. And in fact, that's exactly what they did. And I think they're now in the top 10 or top 12 of the freest countries in the world, because they've been so forward looking. They haven't been trying to reproduce old approaches to things. So it's not surprising to me that that a country like Estonia would do that. Switzerland, again, has always been at the cutting edge of technology and innovation. That's where their strength is. And again, I think that one of the lessons here that Wolfgang brought up was that large countries, in one sense, have a disadvantage because they are large, and they figure, well, we have an economy that's maybe more diverse. So we can be a little bit lazy about some of these things like blockchain. And the answer is, well, no. If they want to, if they want to emerge, and if they want to have their population, become more prosperous and become, part of the developed world as opposed to the emerging economies, they really do have to. Governments really do have to pay attention to this. I was struck by the comment that, you're going to be left out if you don't get it, if governments don't look at blockchain seriously. And I would say it's almost like I remember friends 30 or 40 years ago saying, well, I don't know about this internet thing and personal computers. I mean, we've got, physical papers, and I get magazines, and I communicate that way. And I say, guys, you're going to be, you're going to be out of the loop completely if you don't look at what's coming in the future. And I think that's certainly the case for blockchain.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Professor Rob.
We pretty much covered this thing as far as my knowledge and capability from top to bottom. So I'll hold off and wait till we get to the closing remarks and wrap up.
Yes, we directly want to go for the closing remarks, but before that, Mr. Stewart and Mr. Homestoner, if you want to add something from your industrial experience, That is my, yeah, Mr. Stewart. Mr. Stewart.
Yes, certainly. Yes, certainly. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Good, excellent. There's a couple of things that I've picked up in his last points that were really helpful here. One point is that from experience, very interesting listening to yourself in regards to Estonia, because you're absolutely right. One of the biggest issues around implementation of blockchain today is how it surrounds legacy systems and how it gets to move on to something which it can actually complement, but also replace. And it's going to be very difficult to be able to create that in a very functional manner, because I think one, is going to cost a lot of money, and two, there's a lot of concern that it will end up in system failure. So there's this kind of, how do we trust something that's so new to replace something that's always worked quite well for so long? What is interesting is I think we are seeing acceleration in this fourth industrial revolution happening at such a pace that technology is going to very much lead on this. And the way I see distributed ledger technology roles kind of panning out is about being one of the foundation stones of this. So it's not just about its operation in isolation, but also it's in its operation around actually how it supports all the other technologies and how it works. Of course, energy efficiency is going to be the big factor around this. We've got to remember that this isn't something that comes for free. So how do we manage that process? And obviously there's lots of press and Twitter feed out there on that already, as we well know from various famous rocket scientists and people. But I think one of the key factors here is how do we kind of manage that going forward? And I think the comments we've made throughout this kind of last kind of certainly half an hour or so I've been on the call, you can understand why that the direction of travel is only going to lead to actually becoming more and more integral to that point. My final comment to Sharif, if I can please, is that from our perspective on not just an industry basis, we are very much looking at as a use on terms of human impact as well. You know, economies need to adjust and change. We can't drive on a fossil carbon-based fueled type of industry going forward anymore. We need to now think about the human impact. We've seen a tremendous kind of change in the last 12 months with the pandemic, but putting that aside with the climate emergency, we're trying to move and shift the way economies work. And we need to see them more focused around social and humanitarian impacts. And the blockchain has the ability to manage that kind of data that actually will interest economics. You know, so I think if we can see how that can integrate more, I think the blockchain has a really big role to play, because it will be trustworthy data that's not just financial, it's not just economic led, but actually, you know, banks will start to look at other areas around sustainability and different types of information that's non-financially related. So I think this is a really, really important role to play, and it's great to kind of share that today with you.
Thank you, Mr. Homenstoner.
I shall pause there.
Listening to Stewart there, it was very fascinating. In fact, I had this very discussion with my bankers in London just yesterday about this, and he sounded like like a duplicate of that conversation. But the big banks over there, Barclays, HSBC, the rest of the big international banks, they've all opened blockchain departments in their banks. They know that this is to be reckoned with in the future. In my particular case, because I deal with small companies and micro companies and helping them connect and grow, this is we have a couple of practical applications that we've done here just in the last week. We have a company that does community development for housing programs, and they have put a blockchain program together for all the vendors, their finance, their buyers, all of the proprietary information that goes into a blockchain to make it easier for the banks to look at all that information, evaluate it, and to finance it. So it's making it go faster and more efficiently. Same with, there's a company in Toronto called Live Nation, and they're the biggest concert promotions company in the world. And what they've done is integrated blockchain into their ticketing sales so that they can actually find that they can stop ticket scalping, and they can integrate information in the ticket, embed information in the ticket in a blockchain that will identify people that have had their COVID tests, have had their shots, so they can come and go into these events that they put on. So these are practical applications. This is going to happen, whether we like it or not. This is reality, okay? And it's practically and efficiently being put into small business. And once it gets into small business, that's when it really gets traction and starts to go.
Thank you. I directly want to go for the concluding remarks for today. First, Professor Edward, then Professor Rob, then Mr. Stewart, and finally, Mr. Holmstoner. What's your concluding remarks for today?
Well, I mean, I think we've really covered pretty much everything we can on blockchain. There's anyone who's listening who is interested, I suggest following up on this. I know that Rob has posted a few very good links, and there's a lot of very good material on this. Become, for your listeners, especially your young listeners, become conversant and understand this new technology and how it fits into the entire ecosystem of exponential technology that's emerging in the future. And, whether you become an expert on this or whether it's something you understand kind of in the full context of this future ecosystem, it's going to be of great importance to you and to your own, career, and certainly to your country and to the world.
Thank you. Professor Rob.
Well, as we mentioned earlier, we often talk about, where would you focus your career if you're in school now? How do you know certain jobs are going to be there when you come out? And this is one of the areas that's going through expansion. So building up a competency in blockchain, and perhaps having a second competency in banking and finance would be a almost certain strong career choice at this particular moment. Those bridge jobs are incredibly valuable, and this would allow you to be pretty much assured that by the time you came out of college or university, you'd have a place to go. And do recognize as we roll this stuff out, there are going to be huge shortages of skill shortages, and that provides job opportunities for you guys coming through the education system. So once again, and if you've got kids, STEM, once again, a showcase that STEM education is going to be critical to the future. Make sure your kids are getting plenty of STEM education. And then finally, if you're a government and you're not involved in blockchain, you're about to be locked out of a whole lot of financial markets. And this is not something you want to put off to the future, because we're in the blockchain wave now. If you wait until all of your suppliers and banks have already converted over, you're going to be locked out.
Thank you. Mr. Stewart.
Well, to complement both those ending comments, I think the digital age we are in has brought about immense disruption and game changers as we've kind of worked forward over the last, and this is rapidly accelerating to create a very different world in which we live. Now, these themselves give rise to incredible innovations. So my advice, absolutely kind of mirroring my two fellow speakers beforehand, is to go and learn and educate and understand, because I think to be able to understand not necessarily the technological detail behind DLT and blockchain technology, but also to understand its implications and interpretations of how it can be applied, is going to be absolutely critical in terms of new job creation, but also in terms of being able to create something that works well. And you're absolutely right, Rob. If governments do not take absolute clear notice of this, they will be locked out of the large institutions and the way things work. The banks are making a difference. They're trying to get involved, but the banks are the worst of the legacy systems as well. It will take banks a very, very long time to make this transformational shift. And the thing here is it's about transforming the notion of commitment and contract towards innovation. We're trying to create more transparency and trust. We're trying to bring something around that's actually been lost immensely over the last kind of 10 or 15 years. So it's very exciting. So thank you very much for inviting me on, Sharif. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you, Mr. Stewart. Mr. Holmstoner.
Well, to recap, everybody, and it was a pleasure listening to everybody put in their views, because it's always interesting to me. I try to learn something every day, and I've learned something today, so I thank you guys. Basically, the way, because of the role that I take, my role is basically practicality. I have to make sure that this is practical for a small business. And why it's practical. The 3 points that the gentleman made prior to me is the number one is it's going to represent a huge opportunity for job applicants in the future to learn that this is part of the technology revolution, and to be part of it is to be in it, to be employed in it, and to develop it. Secondly is to internationalize it, make it global, so that it has no challenges, no impediments, so that it can grow environmentally. It can grow through its ecosystem, as you were saying. And thirdly, as Stewart was saying, the banks. The banks are very well aware that they can get ground up in the spokes here very quickly and get left out, because once these things are encrypted, you can't get in. And you're either in or you're out. So those are the facts. And to make it practical and easy to use is the key element, so that more and more and more people can employ the technology to make it more viable, to make it grow into the future. And I think that blockchain is inevitable, and it's going to grow, and it's going to grow like a mushroom. It's going to explode in growth. And you're either, as we said before, all of us said, you're either in or you're out.
Thank you, Mr. Homestoner, and thank you all of our speakers. This is our 283 episode. Last 1 year, we're trying to add 300 different corporations, 100 different countries, and most important thing is that from Asia Pacific around the world, 40% people live in Asia Pacific, and many of the countries are developing nation. Still, we have to integrate it with more technology, more advanced science, engineering, and this kind of things. So we need proper collaborations with the developed nations. That is the things actually World Talent Economy Forums are doing. But I'm very much sure, I'm very much confirmed that many countries, even country like India, country like China, country like Malaysia, Indonesia, Vietnam, Bangladesh, Pakistan, many countries, they are getting a lot of benefit through our this kind of knowledge-based discussions. Every day we are engaging with many organizations. They are sharing our content, but I request everyone, share our content as much as possible. We need to work together, because there are millions of people still they are untouched. They are like outside of modern science, engineering, and technology. So this is the objective of World Talent Economy Forum. We need to engage with more people, and we need more support from our speakers. So thank you everyone for joining today's sessions. It's really, really great session and great learning for us. Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.